great to be with you for this final talk in this series, looking at this ground zero statement for who God is. Let's read it one more time together to remind us. Verses 6 and 7 of Exodus chapter 3, this God Has a Name series where he defines his character for us and to Moses. Verse 6, and he, the Lord, passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. Keep that passage of the Bible open in front of you or on your devices. And I'm going to begin by starting a story. It's a boy meets girl story, a dance up in Sale, Manchester. And this boy meets girl. I don't know whether it was, I don't know all the details of this part of the story. I don't know whether it was love at first sight and all happy, or whether one was forced on the other. But at the end of this tryst, a baby was born and a little girl was born. And that meant that the mum and dad in that society, that culture, there was already shame surrounding it, but they had to get married. It wasn't the best or the happiest of marriages. And the father was an alcoholic, and the girl grew up with a father who was alcoholic and who squandered the family's money in gambling. Very sadly, at age just 33, the father died because of his alcoholism. And the girl was just 6 when she lost her father. She had another younger sister, I think a couple of years younger. And they were without a father. They were without a breadwinner. You see, this father had actually come from quite a wealthy family. And the mum was very, very poor. And you'd hope in this situation that the father's family would step in generously and support. But they didn't. They paid a pittance in a kind of monthly allowance. And times were very tough for this family and for this little girl. And they grew up with very, very little and an embittered and angry and sad widow. At age 16, despite being very academically gifted, this girl had to leave school to start earning money. And she quickly start doing very well for herself. Actually, she was very academically gifted. She could have easily gone to university, but she ended up working in the council and civil service and accounts. She was very good with numbers, and she started advancing quite quickly. At about the same stage of life, though, about 17, she went to a Christian rally, an evangelistic talk in a church with loads of other youth from the area. And at the end, the preacher did an altar call to call people to respond to Jesus, to give their life to Jesus. I feel for the preacher in this situation because none of the young people responded except this one girl. Now, in that moment, he might have thought, oh, just one, not a very good evening then. God, what are you doing? But this one girl came forward and she gave her life to Jesus. Jesus stepped into her story, and her life and the story of her life would never be the same again. I'm going to leave it there, though, for now, and I'll pick up the story a little bit later. Let's dive into our Bible passage. So, very quickly, we want to see, the passage starts, beginning of verse 7, maintaining love to thousands. This God maintains love to thousands and thousands. We're meant to see the generosity and lavishness of his love. And forgiving wickedness, rebellion and sin. This is a God who in his very nature is forgiving. He gets up in the morning and looks for people to forgive. He wants to forgive. It's in his very nature. The word for forgiveness there, that word for forgiving, is the word in Hebrew, nasa. It's nothing to do with spaceships or going to the moon. But the word nasa very literally can be translated to lift up or to carry or to take away. To lift up, to carry or to take away. And you don't need to be a genius to realize that's why I'm stood in front of a cross. Because even here in Exodus, in the early part of the Old Testament, we see as God defines himself, we see also a picture, of course, of Jesus, who is God in flesh, who took up our sin and carried them on the cross. took them away. The Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. This is our God, maintains love to thousands, forgives wickedness, rebellion and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. Now, this should be no great surprise to us. This is good news for us. You might remember a couple of weeks ago, we looked at how God was slow to anger, incredibly patient with his people, slow to anger, but that he did get angry. Remember, we defined God's wrath as that kind of unrelenting, relentless antagonism to evil, to sin in all its forms. And thank God we have a God like that. Thank God we have a God of justice. While our politicians do anything to stop from saying sorry and accept their own sin, we are offered forgiveness. If only we'll acknowledge our sin and our need, if only we'll acknowledge our wickedness, rebellion and sin. Elsewhere in the New Testament, it says in 1 John chapter 1, verse 8, that it says that if we claim we are without sin, the only person we deceive is ourselves. The truth isn't in us. We're not really being honest. We all need the forgiveness of God, and God will not leave the guilty unpunished. It then goes on to say, and here's the really tricky phrase to understand, he punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. And we can look at this and we go, how's that fair? Like, I do something wrong and Leo gets punished for it. Is that really the God we're meant to worship? That seems so unfair. That isn't what this is saying. Let's try and clear this up. You see, just a book or two later in Deuteronomy, the same author says this in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 16. Parents are not to be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their parents. Each will die for their own sin. There's still death going on for sin, but the point is the parents have to pay for their own sin and the children have to pay for their own sin. God's not unfair like that. That's not what he's saying. So what is he saying? Well, he's saying that there are consequences for sin. That if, in Old Testament language maybe, your parents went and worshipped other idols from other little g gods from other nations that were no real gods at all, but there was a spiritual power behind that. It can have consequences for you and for your children. But God is determined to work that sin out of your family line. His antagonism is not against you, it's against your sin. It's like he's standing with you against your sin. We also need to understand that this is an idiom, where it says the third and fourth generation, when we're not meant to get all mathematical about this. Actually, the word for generation isn't there in the Hebrew at all. It's just to the third and fourth. So it's meant to match up in our minds with maintaining love to thousands, yet punishing sin to the third and fourth. What we're meant to see here is the incredible imbalance. Imagine a set of scales like this or something, where mercy is weighing down the scales against justice up here. God is a God of justice. They're part of the same thing, but his mercy always trumps his justice. In fact, at the start of James, it says just that in the New Testament. Mercy trumps his justice. And we see that on the cross. There is justice, but there is mercy. We're meant to see the imbalance. Thousands, maintaining love to thousands, yet punishing to the third and fourth. It's just an idiom. We're not meant to get all mathematical about the generations. It's like saying we haven't had great weather in a month of Sundays. Nobody actually thinks, a month of Sundays, 1, 2, 3. That's not the point. You mean in a long time. And here, it's just to the third and fourth. So hopefully that helps unpack what could be, I totally get it, on the face of it, a really difficult verse to understand. But what we mustn't shortchange is that there is this reality of sin that can have a legacy in life, that God is determined to deal with, to eradicate from our family line. You see, it turns out, and I don't know all of your stories as you're sitting there responding to this. You may think of things in your own life or in your parents' life or your grandparents' life that have had a real impact, a negative impact, one generation to the other. I'm really sorry if that's the case, and There's a phrase here that John Mark Comer uses in the book, which I think is really helpful for this. He says, God is forgiving, but sin is not. God is forgiving, but sin is not. The reality is sin is its own punishment sometimes in our families. Sin is its own punishment. Alcoholism, like for this little girl. Gambling for this family. Sin is its own punishment. Obedience, though, is its own reward. Sin is its own punishment. Obedience is its own reward. There are consequences for sin, and sometimes it can take a long time for God to keep working that sin out of our family line. But bring it to him, because he's a God who in his very nature is merciful and forgiving and longs to deal with those things. And sometimes I think we can hold on to these legacies too long. In one way or another, we can become Christians but still believe that these things have a hold on us when they don't need to. God's power through his forgiveness on the cross is all-encompassing. It changes the story completely, and it changes your story and my story, and it changed the story of this girl. Let me pick up the story from the beginning, that I started at the beginning. This girl, 17, becomes a Christian. Her life is turned around. But it's not all plain sailing, because her younger sister came to faith as well. And it changed her life too. But her mum hates the fact that they've become Christians. One night she even walks out of the house. She's so infuriated by their faith that she can see the difference that it's made to her life. But perhaps she's still bitter and angry and unable to receive the love that they have. And she actually leaves the house. She walks out when they were like 2018, that kind of thing. What do the girls do? They get on their knees and pray for their mother, for God to bring her home, to forgive her, to heal her heart, to bring her to know Jesus like they do. You know what? In the subsequent years, she did. That embittered, angry, poor woman found the riches of God's grace break into her life as well as her children's lives. At the age of about 26, this girl had grown up, and she was doing, as I say, really well in the civil service. She had an increasingly good job, increasingly well respected and paid. She was doing well for herself. But then she felt a call to mission. So she packed up her job, left her secure job, and paid for herself to go to missionary college, to theological college. 2 years later, again, obedient to the call of God on her life, she got a one-way ticket on a boat to Ethiopia to share the gospel and to love the people out there. On the boat, she met the man who was going out for the same purpose, who eventually became her husband. Out there in Ethiopia, they did extraordinary work for Jesus. And they saw loads of people come to faith. They translated from English into Amharic prayer books that are still used today by the church in Ethiopia. They broadcast the gospel, starting up Christian radio stations in Addis Ababa, that more and more people might hear the good news about Jesus. They started raising a family. They had 4 children and an adopted Ethiopian son, who they nurtured and embedded the gospel in. And those 4 children had children, quite a lot of them, who again the gospel was embedded into. And you know, those 4 children of one line had children and are currently trying to invest the gospel in their children. You see, that girl who was born out of wedlock, whose father was alcoholic, who died when she was just 6, who grew up in poverty, whose mum was antagonistic to the faith and persecuted her for it, was my gran. And the legacy that God's grace has left in our family to this day, because he broke into that little girl's story. She was the one girl that went forward to that altar call, and the preacher might have thought, oh, not a very good night. I hope he's in glory now and rejoicing over what God's grace did in stepping into that broken girl's life and transforming the the story for generations. God is so good. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. This is our God. I love him. He's transformed my life, my family's life. He's probably transformed yours. Or if you haven't responded to him yet, if there's a part of your life that you want to know that he's going to step into, he could do that today and change the story. Is there a part of brokenness from the past that maybe you haven't fully believed that the cross has dealt with and that his love has? But it has. Go back to him and ask him to eradicate any legacy of that sin. The power of the cross, the power of his forgiveness is there to continue to transform your life, the life of your children and your grandchildren, the life of your friends and your family and all those around you. This is our God. Let's worship him.